On the night of the 11th of November, 1944, a single blip appeared on a radar screen aboard HMCS Haida, a Canadian tribal-class destroyer patrolling the frigid waters of the English Channel. The operator, a young petty officer named Thomas McLeod from Nova Scotia, had been staring at the flickering green screen for 6 hours straight, his eyes burning from fatigue and the dim glow of the equipment. The radar set was temperamental, prone to phantom signals and sudden failures that had earned it a reputation among the crew as unreliable junk that should have been replaced months ago. Earlier that evening, the chief engineer had declared the unit partially malfunctioning, recommending it be taken offline for repairs once the patrol ended. But McLeod had insisted on keeping it running, jury-rigging a failing component with wire and intuition, determined to maintain at least minimal functionality. The English Channel in late 1944 was supposed to be a safe zone, a protected corridor where Allied ships could move freely between British ports and the invasion beaches of Normandy. The German Kriegsmarine had been battered into near insignificance by years of relentless Allied naval and air superiority, its surface fleet reduced to scattered remnants hiding in Norwegian fjords and Baltic harbors. Most Allied naval commanders had grown complacent, believing that the waters off the southern English coast were as safe as Portsmouth Harbor itself. Intelligence reports suggested that German naval forces lacked the strength, the fuel, and the morale to mount any significant operations in the Channel. The Canadian Navy occupied a peculiar position in the Allied naval hierarchy, simultaneously essential and overlooked. Canadian destroyers, corvettes, and frigates had been the backbone of North Atlantic convoy protection throughout the war, escorting merchant ships through the U-boat-infested waters between North America and Britain. Canadian sailors had endured some of the most brutal conditions of the war, battling not just German submarines but also mountainous seas, ice storms, and the monotonous terror of endless ocean patrols. Yet, despite their crucial contributions, Canadian naval forces were often treated as junior partners by their British and American counterparts, assigned to unglamorous patrol duties, while the more prestigious fleet actions went to Royal Navy or U.S. Navy task forces. Canadian ships were frequently equipped with hand-me-down technology, outdated radar systems, and weapons that had been rejected by larger navies. The radar aboard HMCS Haida that night was a perfect example, a Type 271 surface search radar that had been considered obsolescent even when it was installed. British destroyers had already been upgraded to newer models with better range and resolution, but the Canadians were told to make do with what they had. The irony was bitter and not lost on the crew, who joked darkly that they were expected to fight a modern war with equipment their allies had discarded as inadequate. When that faint contact appeared on McLeod's malfunctioning screen, moving in a pattern that seemed deliberately evasive, he faced a decision that would test everything he had learned about radar operation, German naval tactics, and his own judgment under pressure. The contact was intermittent, flickering in and out of existence as the damaged radar struggled to maintain a coherent picture. It could have been a fishing boat, a piece of debris, or simply a ghost echo created by the failing equipment. But something about the movement pattern, the way the contact seemed to be deliberately staying at the edge of detection range, triggered an instinct in McLeod that transcended technical training. McLeod's training had been rushed and incomplete, typical of the Canadian naval experience during the rapid expansion of the war years. Unlike Royal Navy radar operators who had spent months in specialized schools learning the intricacies of their equipment, Canadian operators often received just weeks of instruction before being shipped out to operational vessels. They learned on the job, developing intuition and improvisation skills that compensated for gaps in formal education. McLeod had joined the Navy straight from a fishing village in Cape Breton, where he had spent his youth navigating foggy waters by instinct and experience. That background, seemingly irrelevant to modern naval warfare, had given him an almost supernatural ability to read patterns in chaos, to distinguish meaningful signals from random noise. The decision to report the contact was not straightforward. False alarms were career killers in the Navy, marking operators as unreliable and undermining confidence in already suspect equipment. McLeod had seen competent men transferred to shore duty or demoted after crying wolf too many times. The pressure to remain silent, to dismiss the flickering blip as just another malfunction, was immense. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Henry de Wolfe, was known as a by-the-book officer who valued precision and hated unnecessary drama. Waking him in the middle of the night with a report based on a failing radar and gut feeling could result in harsh consequences. Yet McLeod could not shake the conviction that something was wrong. The contact, when it appeared, moved with purpose. It was not drifting like debris or following the predictable patterns of civilian traffic. Instead, it seemed to be probing, testing the edges of the detection zone, behaving exactly as German naval doctrine prescribed for ships attempting to infiltrate a defended area. McLeod had studied captured German tactical manuals during a training course in Halifax, learning how Kriegsmarine commanders were taught to exploit radar limitations and approach targets from unexpected angles. The pattern on his screen matched those doctrines perfectly. He made the call. His voice cracked slightly as he picked up the intercom to the bridge, announcing a possible surface contact bearing 270 degrees, range approximately 12,000 yards, course and speed uncertain due to intermittent tracking. There was a long pause before De Wolf's voice came back, clipped and skeptical. The commander reminded McLeod that the radar was known to be malfunctioning and asked if he was certain this was not another false return. McLeod, his heart pounding, replied that he could not be certain, but that the movement pattern was consistent with deliberate evasion. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of decision. De Wolf, to his credit, did not dismiss the report. Despite his reputation for strictness, he was also a cautious commander who understood that the cost of ignoring a genuine threat far outweighed the embarrassment of responding to a false alarm. He ordered the crew to battle stations, a decision that sent hundreds of sailors scrambling from their bunks in various states of undress, cursing the interruption to their sleep and assuming this was yet another pointless drill. The ship came alive with the metallic clatter of hatches being sealed, guns being manned, and depth charges being readied. Within minutes, HMCS Haida was transformed from a sleeping vessel into a weapon of war. As HMCS Haida altered course to investigate the contact, McLeod continued to struggle with his failing radar. The image flickered and died repeatedly, forcing him to constantly adjust settings and bypass damaged circuits. Each time the screen went dark, he felt a surge of panic, wondering if he had sent his ship on a wild chase based on nothing more than electronic ghosts. But each time he coaxed the system back to life, the contact reappeared, now closer and moving with increasing urgency. The German vessels, if that was what they were, seemed to sense they had been detected and were accelerating toward their target before the alarm could be fully raised. The broader tactical situation was more precarious than anyone aboard Haida realized. 20 miles to the northeast, anchored in a supposedly secure zone off the Isle of Wight, lay a concentration of Allied shipping that represented a strategic prize beyond measure. Supply ships loaded with ammunition and fuel for the continuing campaign in France, troop transports preparing to ferry reinforcements across the Channel, and several capital ships undergoing minor repairs after supporting operations along the coast. The anchorage was lightly defended, protected more by the assumption of safety than by actual naval or air patrols. Most of the escorting destroyers had been pulled away for other duties, leaving only a handful of small patrol craft and the comfort of false security. German naval intelligence had been monitoring this anchorage for weeks, noting the patterns of ships arriving and departing, documenting the lax security measures, and identifying the perfect moment to strike. The operation had been planned with meticulous care by a Kriegsmarine staff desperate to prove their continuing relevance to a Führer who had lost faith in his surface navy. A flotilla of E-boats, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes, had been assembled at Cherbourg under conditions of absolute secrecy. These vessels were the last effective striking force the German Navy possessed in the Channel, manned by fanatical crews who viewed this mission as a chance to redeem their service's tattered honor. The E-boats were specifically designed for this type of raid. Small, fast, and heavily armed, they could dash in under cover of darkness, launch their torpedoes at anchored targets, and escape before effective countermeasures could be organized. Their low profile made them difficult to detect visually, and their wooden hulls reduced their radar signature, making them nearly invisible to the outdated equipment that most patrol vessels carried. The German plan relied on speed, surprise, and the exploitation of Allied complacency. Intelligence reports had assured the raid commanders that the approaches to the anchorage were only lightly patrolled by Canadian and British destroyers whose radar systems were known to be inferior. What the German planners had not anticipated was the stubborn refusal of one Canadian radar operator to accept that his malfunctioning equipment should be shut down. They had not factored in the possibility that a jury-rigged system, held together by improvisation and determination, might detect their approach when newer, more sophisticated British radars had failed to do so. The success of their mission depended on remaining undetected until they were within torpedo range of the anchored fleet, and that element of surprise was now in jeopardy because of a single Canadian destroyer and one operator's instinct that something was wrong. De Wolf ordered radio silence broken, transmitting an urgent warning to the Naval Command Center at Portsmouth. The message was terse and shocking. Possible enemy surface units approaching the Isle of Wight. Anchorage, contact, intermittent, but assessed as genuine threat. The response from shore was immediate and skeptical. The duty officer at Portsmouth questioned whether Haida's radar was functioning properly, reminding De Wolf that the equipment had been logged as defective just hours earlier. There was a bureaucratic resistance to the idea that German surface vessels could be operating in the Channel, a cognitive dissonance born of months of unchallenged Allied superiority. De Wolf, his voice tight with controlled anger, replied that he was maintaining contact and moving to intercept. He requested immediate support from any available units and recommended that the anchorage be placed on maximum alert. Minutes felt like hours as Haida closed the distance. McLeod's radar now showed multiple contacts, at least 4 distinct vessels moving in formation toward the anchorage. The Germans had dropped any pretense of stealth and were racing at full speed toward their target, clearly aware that they had been detected and gambling that they could still reach torpedo launch range before being stopped. The E-boats were capable of speeds exceeding 40 knots, far faster than Haida could manage. De Wolf realized with cold clarity that his ship could not intercept the raiders before they reached the anchorage. The only hope was to disrupt their attack run, to force them to evade and waste precious time, buying minutes for the sleeping fleet to raise anchors and scatter. Haida's main guns opened fire at a range of 8,000 yards, lobbing shells toward the contacts that were still barely visible as dark shapes against the black water. The destroyer's 4.7-inch guns thundered in rapid succession, their muzzle flashes illuminating the deck and temporarily destroying the night vision of everyone topside. The gunners were firing blind, relying entirely on radar data transmitted from McLeod's struggling equipment. Most of the shells fell short, raising columns of water that glowed eerily in the darkness. But the gunfire achieved its primary purpose, announcing to the German commanders that their approach was known and contested. The E-boats split formation, a standard tactic designed to divide pursuing forces and create multiple threats that could not all be engaged simultaneously. 2 vessels veered west, attempting to circle around Haida and approach the anchorage from a different angle. The other 2 maintained their direct course, gambling that they could slip past the Canadian destroyer in the confusion. De Wolf was forced to choose, to commit his ship to pursuing one group, while the other escaped his attention. He chose to pursue the direct threat, ordering Haida to maximum speed and hoping that his warning had given the anchorage enough time to respond. In the anchorage, chaos was beginning to spread as duty officers aboard the sleeping ships processed the warning from Haida. Bells rang, claxons blared, and hundreds of sailors who had been contentedly asleep moments before found themselves racing to battle stations, still unclear about what threat they faced. Some captains, responding with the urgency the situation demanded, ordered immediate preparation to get underway. Others, skeptical or slow to react, hesitated, requesting confirmation or clarification that wasted precious seconds. The ammunition ships, sitting low in the water with their deadly cargoes, were priority targets that represented catastrophic danger if hit. Their crews worked frantically to start cold engines and prepare to move to open water, where they would be harder to target and where an explosion would not trigger a chain reaction. The first E-boat that attempted to slip past Haida met a wall of fire that turned the night into day. The destroyer's guns, now tracking with the desperation of men who understood the stakes, found their target at a range of less than 3,000 yards. Shells struck the E-boat's wooden hull, tearing through the light structure and igniting fuel tanks. The German vessel exploded in a ball of orange flame that reflected off the water, illuminating the other raiders and revealing their positions to Canadian gunners who immediately shifted fire. The crew of the destroyed E-boat had no chance to escape, consumed in seconds by the inferno that had been their ship. The explosion served as a brutal announcement that the Allied fleet was no longer defenseless. The remaining E-boats pressed their attack with the fanaticism of men who knew retreat meant failure. They closed to within torpedo range of the anchorage, their commanders selecting targets from among the clustered ships that represented months of Allied logistical effort. Torpedoes leaped from their tubes, arcing through the water on courses calculated to intersect with anchored vessels that were just beginning to move. The German sailors, knowing they were now operating under fire and likely would not survive the night, were determined to inflict maximum damage before they were destroyed. The torpedoes ran true, their wake barely visible in the dark water, homing in on ships whose crews could only watch in horror as death approached at 40 knots. But the extra minutes that Haida had bought, the chaos and confusion that had been created by its lone warning and aggressive pursuit, proved decisive. Several of the targeted ships had already begun moving, their courses and positions different from what the German commanders had calculated when they launched their torpedoes. 2 torpedoes passed harmlessly through water, where ammunition ships had been anchored just minutes before, their deadly cargo wasted on empty sea. A third struck a supply vessel, a glancing blow that failed to detonate the warhead, leaving the torpedo to sink harmlessly to the bottom. Only one torpedo found its mark, slamming into the hull of a transport ship and exploding, with a concussion that could be felt miles away. The transport heaved upward from the blast, its midship section torn open, and water flooding into compartments where soldiers had been sleeping. The ship began to list immediately, alarms screaming as damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding. But the vessel did not explode, did not trigger the catastrophic secondary detonations that would have occurred if an ammunition ship had been hit. The soldiers aboard, thrown from their bunks by the impact, scrambled topside in various states of panic and confusion, donning life jackets and preparing to abandon ship. Destroyers and patrol craft raced toward the stricken vessel, ready to rescue survivors, while other ships continued their efforts to disperse and deny the remaining E-boats concentrated targets. Haida, having destroyed one raider and scattered the rest, now faced the 2 E-boats that had attempted to circle around its position. These vessels, realizing that the element of surprise was lost and that their mission had failed, turned away at maximum speed, attempting to escape back to German-held ports before dawn brought Allied aircraft that would hunt them mercilessly. De Wolf faced another decision: pursue the fleeing raiders and risk being lured into a trap, or remain in position to protect the anchorage from any additional threats. He chose pursuit, ordering his crew to maintain fire as long as the raiders remained in range, determined to exact as high a price as possible for the German audacity. The chase lasted for nearly an hour, a high-speed pursuit through waters that were treacherous even in daylight. The E-boats used every trick their experienced commanders knew, zigzagging wildly to throw off Haida's aim, laying smoke screens that temporarily obscured them from visual tracking, and attempting to lead their pursuer into known minefields that might destroy the Canadian destroyer where their guns had failed. MacLeod, his eyes now streaming, with tears from exhaustion and strain, kept his failing radar functioning through sheer force of will, calling out ranges and bearings that allowed Haida's guns to continue firing even when visual contact was lost. One of the fleeing E-boats made a fatal error, turning too sharply while attempting to evade and exposing its full profile to Haida's guns at a range of less than 4,000 yards. The Canadian gunners, who had been firing at phantoms and glimpses for the past hour, seized the opportunity with savage efficiency. A salvo of shells struck the E-boat amidships, the impact tearing the vessel nearly in half. The German craft slowed immediately, its stern sinking rapidly, while the bow pointed skyward at an impossible angle. Survivors could be seen leaping into the freezing water, their life jackets bright against the dark sea. De Wolf ordered his ship to slow and lower boats to rescue the German sailors, a decision that allowed the remaining E-boat to escape, but reflected the humanity that persisted even in the midst of brutal combat. The rescued Germans, hauled aboard Haida and stripped of their soaked clothing, were young men who looked far older than their years. They had the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of sailors who had been fighting a losing war for too long, sustained only by duty and the fading hope that their sacrifices might matter. Under interrogation, they revealed the full scope of the planned attack: 4 E-boats tasked with destroying as many ships as possible in the anchorage, with special emphasis on ammunition vessels and troop transports. They admitted that intelligence had assured them the approach would be lightly defended, that Canadian radar was unreliable, and that they would likely achieve complete surprise. The failure of the mission, they said with a mixture of relief and shame, was due entirely to one ship that had detected them when it should not have been able to do so. As dawn broke over the English Channel, the full extent of what had been prevented became clear. The anchorage, which should have been a scene of catastrophic destruction with burning ships and hundreds of casualties, was instead mostly intact. The single transport ship that had been torpedoed was being towed to shallow water where it could be beached and salvaged, its crew rescued with only minor casualties. The ammunition ships, the true targets of the raid, were all safe and preparing to resume their missions of supplying the armies fighting across the Channel. The disaster that would have set back Allied operations by weeks or months had been averted by the narrowest of margins. Recognition came slowly, filtered through layers of naval bureaucracy that were reluctant to admit how close catastrophe had come. The official reports praised the vigilance of patrol forces, while downplaying the intelligence failure that had left the anchorage vulnerable. De Wolf received a commendation for aggressive action in defense of Allied shipping. McLeod, the radar operator whose determination had started the chain of events that saved the fleet, was mentioned only briefly in the reports. His role downplayed because acknowledging it would require admitting that the equipment he used was defective and should have been offline. The broken radar that had saved thousands of lives was finally replaced, scrapped as obsolete technology that had performed far beyond its designed capabilities in the hands of an operator who refused to give up on it. The strategic implications of the failed raid extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The E-boat flotilla that had been assembled for the attack represented one of the last offensive capabilities the Kriegsmarine possessed in Western waters. Its destruction removed a significant threat and further eroded German ability to contest Allied naval supremacy. More importantly, the failed raid convinced German Naval Command that operations in the Channel were no longer viable, that even supposedly vulnerable targets were too well defended to justify the risk. Future German naval efforts would be directed elsewhere, leaving Allied supply lines unmolested during the critical final months of the war. For the Canadian Navy, the incident at the Isle of Wight provided validation that was both welcome and frustrating. It demonstrated that Canadian sailors and their ships, despite being equipped with hand-me-down technology and relegated to unglamorous duties, were fully capable of decisive action when the moment demanded it. The aggressive response of HMCS Haida, the skill of its crew, and the determination of operators like McLeod had achieved what more powerful forces might have failed to accomplish. Yet the recognition of this achievement was muted, filtered through a military hierarchy that still viewed Canadian forces as auxiliaries rather than equals. McLeod returned to his normal duties, continuing to operate radar equipment that was frequently obsolescent and prone to failure. He never spoke publicly about the night he detected the E-boat raid, maintaining the silence that military regulations and personal modesty demanded. His shipmates knew what had happened, and that knowledge created a quiet respect that needed no official recognition. To them, McLeod represented the thousands of Canadian sailors who performed their duties with skill and dedication despite being given inadequate tools and insufficient appreciation. His moment of decision, when he chose to report a contact that could have been dismissed as a malfunction, exemplified the professionalism that characterized the Canadian naval contribution to the war. The underestimation of Canadian forces that had allowed German planners to believe the anchorage was vulnerable reflected a broader pattern of dismissiveness that persisted throughout the war. Axis powers repeatedly failed to account for the effectiveness of Canadian military units, assuming that colonial forces would be second-rate and poorly led. This miscalculation, whether applied to infantry battalions in Italy, armored formations in Normandy, or naval vessels in the Atlantic, consistently resulted in unpleasant surprises for German commanders who discovered too late that the Canadians they faced were as skilled and determined as any troops in the Allied order of battle. The radar that saved the fleet, the malfunctioning Type 271 that should have been offline, became something of a legend aboard HMCS Haida. Even after it was replaced, stories about the broken radar circulated among the crew, growing in the telling until they took on mythic qualities. Some sailors claimed the equipment had been so badly damaged it should not have worked at all, that McLeod had kept it functioning through sheer willpower and technical wizardry. Others insisted that the radar had displayed contacts more clearly that night than it ever had when functioning properly, as if the machine itself had understood the stakes and risen to the occasion. The truth, as always, was more prosaic, but no less remarkable. A trained operator with good instincts had coaxed meaningful information from failing equipment and his commanders had trusted his judgment enough to act on it. The lessons from the Isle of Wight incident were studied by naval analysts seeking to understand how a potential catastrophe had been averted. Several factors emerged as critical to the successful defense. First was the importance of maintaining patrol coverage even in supposedly secure areas, a lesson that challenged the tendency toward complacency that had left the anchorage vulnerable. Second was the value of trusting experienced operators to interpret ambiguous data, recognizing that human judgment remained essential even in an age of increasing technological sophistication. Third was the necessity of aggressive response to potential threats, demonstrated by de Wolf's decision to go to battle stations and pursue based on uncertain information. The incident also highlighted the tension between technological capability and operational effectiveness. The Type 271 radar that detected the E-boats was objectively inferior to newer systems being deployed on British destroyers, yet in the hands of a skilled operator it performed the essential task of detecting and tracking targets. This suggested that the relationship between equipment quality and mission success was more complex than simple technological superiority. Training, experience, and determination could compensate for equipment limitations, while the best technology could fail if operators were poorly trained or lacked the judgment to interpret what their instruments were telling them. Canadian naval doctrine evolved in response to the experiences of ships like HMCS Haida, incorporating lessons about persistence, improvisation, and aggressive action. The emphasis placed on individual initiative and decision-making at all levels of command, already a feature of Canadian military culture, was reinforced by incidents that demonstrated the importance of junior officers and enlisted personnel making critical choices in fluid situations. This decentralized approach, born partly from necessity and partly from national character, proved well suited to the demands of modern naval warfare, where communication could be disrupted and situations could change faster than central command could respond. The human cost of the incident was relatively light, particularly when measured against what might have been. The transport ship that was torpedoed lost fewer than 20 men, a tragedy for their families but a miraculously low number given the circumstances. The German casualties were higher, with 2 E-boats destroyed and most of their crews killed. The survivors rescued by Haida spent the remainder of the war in prisoner camps, grateful to be alive and removed from a conflict they knew was lost. Some of these men, interviewed decades later, spoke with rueful respect about the Canadian destroyer that had ruined their mission, acknowledging that they had been told the Canadians would be ineffective and that this intelligence had proven catastrophically wrong. The broader narrative of Canadian military contributions during the Second World War is filled with similar stories of underestimation and unexpected effectiveness. Whether in the frozen hell of the Scheldt estuary, the beaches of Normandy, or the night waters of the English Channel, Canadian forces repeatedly demonstrated capabilities that surprised both allies and enemies. The incident at the Isle of Wight was not an isolated moment of heroism, but rather a representative example of a pattern that characterized the Canadian wartime experience. Given inadequate equipment and insufficient recognition, Canadian service members nevertheless performed with skill and determination that achieved results far beyond what might have been expected. The aftermath of the war saw MacLeod return to civilian life, resuming the quiet existence he had left behind when he enlisted. He worked as a fisherman and later as a harbor master in his Nova Scotia hometown, rarely speaking about his wartime service except when pressed by curious young people who wanted to hear stories from the veterans in their community. When he did speak, he emphasized the teamwork and professionalism of his shipmates rather than his own role, deflecting credit in a way that was typical of his generation. The moment that had defined his war, the decision to report a contact on a failing radar screen, was presented as simply doing his job rather than as an act of particular courage or insight. The recognition that eventually came to MacLeod arrived decades after the events, when historians combing through naval archives began to piece together the full story of the prevented raid. His name appeared in accounts of the incident, and he was contacted by researchers seeking to understand what had happened that night. In interviews conducted when he was an old man, MacLeod spoke candidly about his doubts and fears, about the pressure he felt to remain silent rather than report what might have been a false contact. He credited his commanding officer for trusting his judgment and acting decisively despite the uncertainty. Most of all, he expressed gratitude that the raid had been stopped and that the ships in the anchorage had been saved. The transformation of the Canadian identity during and after the Second World War owed much to incidents like the one at the Isle of Wight. A nation that had begun the war as a dominion within the British Empire, expected to provide resources and manpower for British strategic objectives, emerged as an independent power with its own military traditions and capabilities. The thousands of Canadian sailors, soldiers, and airmen who served with distinction created a legacy that shaped national self-perception for generations. The underestimation they faced from both enemies and allies, and the consistent manner in which they exceeded those low expectations, became a source of quiet pride and a foundation for post-war Canadian confidence. The story of the broken radar that saved the fleet became part of the larger narrative of Canadian resourcefulness and determination. It joined other tales of improvisation and effectiveness in the face of material limitations, stories that celebrated the ability of Canadians to achieve results despite being given second-best equipment and last priority in resource allocation. This narrative, while sometimes exaggerated in the retelling, contained essential truth. Canadian forces did operate with less than their allies, did face underestimation from their enemies, and did nevertheless achieve remarkable success through skill, courage, and refusal to accept limitations as excuses for failure. The technical legacy of the incident influenced post-war naval development, as analysts recognized that Newsing 5 radar technology was only as effective as the operators using it. Canadian naval training programs placed increased emphasis on operator judgment and the interpretation of ambiguous data, acknowledging that future conflicts would present similar situations where technological limitations or equipment failures would require human skill to overcome. The balance between automation and human judgment remains a central question in military technology. And the lesson from McLeod's experience, that trained intuition and determination can compensate for equipment failures, continues to resonate. As the final years of McLeod's life approached, he was invited to return to England for a ceremony commemorating the naval actions that had protected the Channel supply routes. Standing on the deck of a modern Canadian warship, equipped with radar systems that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944, he reflected on how much had changed and how much remained the same. The technology was vastly superior, the ships faster and more powerful, but the essential nature of naval service, the long hours of vigilance, and the moments of sudden crisis remained unchanged. He spoke briefly to the assembled sailors and dignitaries, emphasizing that he had simply been doing his duty and that the real heroes were the men who had not made it home. The underestimation of Canadian forces by the Axis powers during the Second World War proved to be one of the more consistent strategic errors made by German and Italian military planners. Whether born from prejudice against colonial troops, ignorance of Canadian military traditions, or simple failure to properly assess Allied order of battle, this underestimation led to repeated tactical and operational failures. The incident at the Isle of Wight exemplified this pattern in microcosm. German intelligence had dismissed Canadian patrol vessels as ineffective, equipped with obsolete technology and manned by second-rate personnel, only to discover that determination and skill could overcome material limitations. The preserved lesson from the Isle of Wight incident extends beyond the specific details of that November night. It speaks to the importance of individual initiative in military operations, the value of trusting experienced personnel to make judgment calls based on incomplete information, and the necessity of maintaining vigilance, even when threat seems unlikely. Modern military doctrines that emphasize decentralized command and empower junior leaders to make independent decisions owe something to examples like McLeod's choice to report an ambiguous contact and de Wolf's decision to act. On that report, despite its uncertain foundation, the final disposition of the Type 271 radar that detected the E-boat raid remains unknown. It was likely scrapped along with thousands of other pieces of obsolete equipment in the massive demobilization that followed the war's end. No museum preserved it as a significant artifact. No memorial commemorates its role in preventing disaster. This anonymity seems fitting for a piece of equipment that was remarkable not for any inherent qualities but for what a determined operator was able to achieve with it. The radar itself was ordinary, even substandard, but in the right hands at the right moment, it became the tool that saved thousands of lives. McLeod died in 1987, having lived to see the Cold War end and a new generation take up the responsibilities of defending Canadian interests. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service but gave no details, noting only that he had served aboard HMCS Haida and had been present for several significant actions. The full story of his role in preventing the Isle of Wight disaster remained known only to military historians and veterans who had served with him. This quiet passing, without fanfare or public recognition, was entirely in keeping with his character and with the experience of thousands of Canadian veterans who had performed extraordinary service in a time of crisis and then returned to ordinary lives. The broken radar and the man who refused to give up on it both passed into history, their moment of decisive importance preserved in archives and memories, a testament to the truth that battles are won not just by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by the determination of individuals who refuse to accept failure when success is still possible.